On a Saturday morning in October of 1977, in the middle of the most productive apple-growing valley in America, a 35-year-old widow paid $192 in cash for 260 chickens that every credentialed expert in Washington state said had no business inside a commercial orchard. The men at the Quincy diner laughed when they heard. They were still laughing 6 years later on the morning the worms ate everyone else's harvest. Her name was Nora Halverson. She had brown hair that she kept pinned back with 2 tortoiseshell clips she had owned since before she was married. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had been working an orchard since she was old enough to hold a pruning hook. The skin around her knuckles had cracked and healed so many times over the years that the lines there had become permanent, like the grain in a piece of old wood. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, and she did not waste words, which was something people in Grant County either respected or mistook for coldness depending on who they were and what they wanted from her. She had been a widow for 18 months when she drove north toward Twisp in her 1972 Chevrolet C20 pickup on the morning of October 22, 1977, with a borrowed 2-axle stock trailer hitched behind her and a folded brown paper envelope in the inside pocket of her canvas field jacket. The envelope held $192 in cash. She had been keeping it in a tin coffee canister on the kitchen shelf since the spring of 1976, which was the spring her husband, Eric Halverson, had been killed at 38 years old by a tractor rollover on the steep upper section of their home orchard on Cedar Ridge Road outside Quincy, Washington. Eric had been working the east slope alone that morning. He had done it 100 times. The ground had been soft from 3 days of rain, and the machine had gone over before he had any chance to react. Their son, Caleb, had been 10 years old. He had been at school when it happened. Nora had been in the lower orchard pulling a clogged irrigation line when Earl Voss, her part-time hired man, had come running down through the trees to find her. The farm was 60 acres of rolling apple ground on the south face of Cedar Ridge Road, 3 miles outside of Quincy. The Halverson family had been on that ground since 1931, when Nora's father-in-law, Gunnar Halverson, had bought the original 30 acres and spent 11 years clearing the upper section by hand before the first trees went in. Eric had expanded it to 60 acres in 1968. The trees were mature and well-established. In a good year, with the standard spray program running clean, the orchard could yield enough to keep the family solvent with a modest margin left over. In a bad year, the margin disappeared and you borrowed against the next season. That was the arithmetic of small orchard farming in the Wenatchee Valley in 1977. And it was an arithmetic Nora understood completely. What she also understood by the autumn of 1977 was that the standard spray program was not going to hold. She had first understood it in the winter of 1976. Sitting at the kitchen table after Caleb had gone to bed, reading a hand-bound agricultural manual that her mother-in-law Helga had brought over in a cardboard box, along with a set of cast-iron skillets and a bag of dried beans when she had moved into the Wenatchee retirement home that September. The manual was small and dense and bound in gray-green cloth that had gone soft at the corners from decades of handling. It had been written in 1872 in western Norway, in the Hardanger Fjord district, by a farmer named Svenine Halverson, who had been integrating heritage poultry with apple orchards on her family's land since 1864. It was 148 pages long. It was written in a Norwegian script so archaic that Nora had needed 2 weeks and a Norwegian English dictionary her father-in-law had ordered from a Minneapolis bookshop in 1953 to work through the first 30 pages. The manual had come west with Nora's husband's grandmother, a woman named Sigrid Halverson, who had immigrated from the Hardanger district to the Wenatchee Valley in 1908 at the age of 20. Sigrid had packed it in a small carved birchwood box bound with hemp twine, along with a set of hand-drawn anatomical diagrams showing the life cycle of the European apple moth and the digestive response of the buff Orpington hen to apple moth larvae. She had also packed a handwritten appendix in faded brown ink that her own grandmother Svenine had compiled between 1855 and 1872, documenting 17 years of pest pressure observations at the Halverson family orchard in Loftus. The appendix contained a single sentence that Sigrid had repeated to every female descendant who came of age on the property, beginning with her daughter Helga and continuing through Helga's children and grandchildren, until the practice had become something between a family tradition and a prophecy. The sentence was this: "Granddaughter, when the commercial spray program collapses, the day will come when our family will need the old Hardanger way again." Sigrid Halverson had died in 1971 at the age of 83. Helga had passed the manual to Nora in the autumn of 1976 when she had moved into the retirement home. Nora had read it 3 times that winter alone at the kitchen table by the light of the overhead bulb, with Caleb asleep upstairs, and the wind coming off the Columbia Basin and pressing itself against the north windows of the farmhouse. By March of 1977, she had read it a 4th time and had begun taking notes in a small green accounting book she kept on the second shelf of the kitchen pantry. What the manual described in precise and measured language was the protocol that the Hardanger district orchardists had been refining for 2.5 centuries against the European apple moth complex. The moth overwinters as a fully developed larva inside a silken cocoon spun into the bark crevices and the leaf litter duff at the base of the apple trees. It emerges in late spring as the adult moth that lays the next generation of eggs on the developing fruit. The Hardanger protocol placed a rotational flock of heavy heritage poultry, specifically the buff Orpington class, into the orchard understory on a 4-week rotational cycle through the dormant winter and early spring months. The birds scratched continuously through the leaf litter and lower bark crevices and consumed the overwintering cocoons as a natural high-protein forage item. The 1872 manual documented an 84% reduction in the overwintering cocoon population across the Loftus family orchards between 1855 and 1872. It documented it with the kind of careful year-by-year notation that a scientist in a laboratory would have recognized immediately as empirical methodology. Svenine Halverson had not known the word empirical. She had known how to count moths, and she had known how to count birds, and she had known how to write down what she saw year after year until the numbers told her something she could trust. The commercial apple industry of the Wenatchee Valley in 1977 operated on a different protocol entirely. The accepted pest control standard was built around an organophosphate insecticide called azinphos methyl sold, under the brand name Guthion, applied through tall, power takeoff-driven air blast sprayers at 14-day intervals from pink stage through harvest. 6 applications per season minimum. The standard orchard maintained bare soil in the row middles through pre-emergent herbicide application to eliminate cover crop competition for water and nutrients. The dominant commercial variety was the Red Delicious, which accounted for approximately 72% of Washington apple acreage in 1977. The heritage varieties Northern Spy, Newtown, Pippin, Roxbury, Russet were considered museum piece curiosities. They were not commercial fruit. Nobody in the wholesale market wanted them. The Yakima packing houses did not run them through the grading lines. The Seattle grocery chains did not stock them. The economics of the Wenatchee Valley apple industry in 1977 had no use for them. The man who represented this consensus most completely in Grant County was a Washington State University cooperative extension tree fruit specialist named Gerald Pfeiffer. He had served in the Grant County Extension Office for 16 years. He was a compact, efficient man of 51, with a gray crew cut and the confidence of someone who had spent a long professional career being right about almost everything he had been asked about, and who had therefore come to believe that being right about almost everything was the same as being right about everything. He drove a new forest green Ford pickup. He kept a clean desk. He had shaken hands with every commercial apple operator in the county, and he knew their acreage and their spray schedules and their yield histories and their bank relationships. And he believed he understood the economics of the Wenatchee Valley orchard industry better than any man alive. He was not wrong about most of it. He was profoundly and consequentially wrong about the one thing that would matter most. Otto Bergstrom was 71 years old and had been carrying the foundation lines of a buff Orpington flock continuously since 1949 on a 40-acre farm outside Twisp in Okanogan County, 60 miles north of Quincy. He had been an orchardist himself until 1962, when his wife had died, and he had sold the apple ground and kept only the poultry operation. He ran a careful, precise breeding program, and he sold his working surplus each autumn to whoever showed up with cash and a trailer. He had been advertising the October dispersal in the 3-cent classifieds of the Wenatchee World since the first week of September. Nora had read the advertisement on a Tuesday evening in mid-September, sitting at the kitchen table with Caleb doing his homework across from her. She had clipped it out and set it under the coffee canister on the kitchen shelf next to the brown envelope with the $192 she had been saving since the spring. She did not tell anyone she was going. She told Earl Voss she would need the stock trailer borrowed from Harold Jessup down the road, and she told him she would be back by 3 in the afternoon. Earl asked her what for. She told him she was going to Twisp to pick up some poultry. Earl looked at her for a moment and then said, "All right," and went back to pulling irrigation line. She arrived at Otto Bergstrom's farm at 9:15 in the morning. Otto was in the yard beside the main poultry building with a clipboard and a pencil, working through the morning count. He was a tall man, slightly stooped, with the unhurried movements of someone who had spent 50 years learning that the animals responded better to calm than to urgency. He looked at Nora's truck and trailer and said good morning and asked what she was looking for. She told him she wanted 240 buff Orpington pullets and 20 buff Orpington roosters. She told him they were going into a 60-acre apple orchard on a rotational understory protocol. She told him she wanted foundation stock with clean leg bands and documented breed lines going back at least 3 generations. Otto Bergstrom set his clipboard down on the hood of his truck. He looked at her for a moment. He asked her where she had learned about the rotational understory protocol. She told him about the 1872 manual. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. He listened without interrupting, which was something she noticed and appreciated. He said he had 300 birds to move from the autumn assessment. He said he would take 75 cents per pullet and $1.20 per rooster. He said the lead hen, a deep golden 3-year-old with an aluminum leg band marked B3, weighed approximately 7.5 pounds and had the best scratch instinct in the flock. Nora counted out the cash from the brown envelope on the hood of his truck. $192 flat. Otto counted it back, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. They loaded the birds for 2 hours and 15 minutes, working without much conversation. The lead hen B3 went into the trailer last. She weighed the trailer down in the back in a way that Nora could feel in the steering wheel all 60 miles home. She pulled onto Cedar Ridge Road at 2:40 in the afternoon. Earl Voss was waiting at the gate. He opened it without being asked. Nora backed the trailer into the upper orchard and opened the rear gate. The 260 buff Orpington hens and roosters walked down the ramp and into the grass and clover understory of the northern spy block with the deliberate calm of birds that had been in trailers before. and were not frightened by it. The lead hen B3 moved 30 feet into the orchard before stopping to scratch. She found something in the duff in the first 40 seconds. Earl Voss stood beside Nora at the orchard gate and watched the birds spread across the understory. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked her what she was going to do about the spray schedule. She told him she was phasing it out over 4 years and converting the lower 30 acres to heritage varieties over the same period. She told him she was going direct market to Seattle specialty buyers and was not contracting to the Yakima packing houses. She told him she was running a closed integrated poultry and apple operation. She told him all of it in the same quiet, unhurried voice she had used with Otto Bergstrom. Earl was quiet for another long moment. Then he said he was going to go pull the irrigation line, and he walked away down the lower fence. He did not say she was wrong. He also did not say she was right. He just went back to work. Nora would understand later that this was the most valuable thing he could have done for her in that moment. On the following Sunday morning, a neighboring orchardist named Roy Callahan drove past the Halverson orchard on his way back from the Quincy First Lutheran Church. He slowed his truck at the upper fence line. He stopped. He sat there for a full minute looking at 240 buff Orpington hens, scratching and dust-bathing in the grass understory beneath the northern spy trees. Then he drove home. Roy Callahan was 60 years old. He was a stocky, barrel-chested man with a face that had gone ruddy from decades of working open-air spray rigs across the Wenatchee Valley. He ran 140 acres of Red Delicious on the road above the Halverson place, and he had been running it for 32 years. He had wanted the Halverson 60 acres before Eric died. He had wanted it more after. He had approached the subject sideways for 18 months. He had stopped by on Sunday afternoons with hot dish casseroles his wife Ruth had made. He had told Nora more than once that any decision she wanted to make about the operation would have his full support. He arrived at the Halverson farmhouse on the Monday morning after the birds came home. He knocked at the kitchen door. Nora was at the kitchen table with her green accounting book open and her pencil working. She let him in. He sat down at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee and told her in the measured voice of a man who believed he was being careful, that he was concerned about what he had seen from the road. He told her that the Washington State University Extension Office had no published commercial production data on integrated poultry protocols for apple orchards. He told her that the Yakima wholesale market wanted standard Red Delicious, and that heritage varieties had no reliable commercial buyer in the Pacific Northwest. He told her that Gerald Pfeiffer had told him personally at the last Washington State Horticultural Association meeting that the Gouthillon program was holding strong across the valley, and that there was no entomological basis for concerns about resistance development. He told her all of this in the voice of a man who believed he was helping her. Nora listened without interrupting. She thanked him for stopping by. She walked him to the door. She went back to the kitchen table. That evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, Earl Voss came to the back step for his end-of-day coffee, which had been the custom on the Halverson place since before Eric died. They sat on the step in the cold October dark with their enamel mugs and listened to the orchard settle. After a while, Earl set his cup down on the step and said there was something he thought she ought to know. He told her that Roy Callahan had sent a real estate intermediary to the Halverson property 3 separate times in the 18 months since Eric's death. 3 times, each time with a different framing. Each time with a different opening number. And each time Nora had not been home or had not answered the door, or the intermediary had lost his nerve at the gate. Earl had been there for all 3 visits. He had not mentioned them before because he had not been certain they were his business to mention. He was certain now. Nora held her coffee mug in both hands and looked at the dark line of the upper orchard against the October sky. She was quiet for a long time. She thought about the casseroles. She thought about the Sunday afternoon visits and the voice Roy had used that morning at the kitchen table. That tone of concern dressed as generosity. She thought about the word support and what it had meant in his mouth. She said she appreciated Earl telling her. Earl picked up his coffee mug and finished what was in it. He stood up from the step and said goodnight and walked to his truck. Nora stayed on the step for another 20 minutes in the cold, alone with what she now understood. Then she went inside and opened the 1872 manual to page 63, where Svenine Halverson had written down the 84% reduction figure in the careful, unhurried hand of a woman who had been keeping records in an orchard for 17 years and had no reason to exaggerate. By the second week of November, the story of the Halverson chickens had traveled, the way all orchard news traveled in Grant County in 1977, through the feed and supply counter, and the diner and the bank lobby and the one-line telephone exchange that ran between Quincy and Wenatchee. The bank manager pulled Nora aside after a routine deposit and asked her in a low and respectful voice whether she had thought through the per-acre pest pressure impact of leaving the orchard floor unsprayed. A woman from the church fellowship hall asked her whether she thought Eric would have approved of the chickens. Nora looked at her across the corner of a folding card table and said, Eric would have asked what her grandmother thought. The woman had nothing to say to that. Nora carried her casserole dish back to the kitchen and washed it herself. At the Quincy diner on the first Thursday of November, a man named Augustus Callahan, who was Roy's older brother, and had bought Northern Spy Budwood off Gunnar Halverson in the 1950s, told three men at the counter that the Halverson widow had let her grief get the better of her judgment. He said it in the same voice he used to describe the weather, which was the voice of a man announcing a fact that required no further discussion. The three men at the counter nodded. The annual meeting of the Washington State Horticultural Association fell on the second Thursday of November that year. It was held in the Wenatchee Valley Convention Center, a low concrete building off 9th Street, with a parking lot that filled by 6:30 in the evening, with trucks and sedans and the occasional station wagon belonging to the wives who came to manage the coffee service. There were approximately 200 people in the main hall by 7 o'clock. Gerald Pfeiffer was the featured speaker for the first session. He stood at the podium in a brown corduroy jacket and a bolo tie, and he moved through the season review with the practiced efficiency of a man who had given this presentation 14 times in 16 years and no longer needed notes for most of it. He talked about the Gutheion schedule and the spray timing adjustments for the 1978 season. He talked about the new federal grade pack standards being considered for the 1984 season and what they might mean for the Wenatchee wholesale market. He talked about cover crop management and herbicide timing and the nitrogen application protocols for mature red delicious blocks. He was thorough and precise and completely confident, and the room listened with the attentiveness of 200 people who believed they were in the presence of a man who knew more about apple farming than any other individual in the state of Washington. And then in the last 15 minutes of his presentation, he talked about integrated poultry protocols. He was not brief about it. He used the word anachronism. He used the phrase turn-of-the-century historical curiosity. He said that free-range poultry in commercial apple orchards had been a reasonable approach when nobody had access to a modern air blast sprayer, and that the development of the organophosphate spray program had rendered the poultry approach obsolete, in the same way that horse-drawn cultivation had been rendered obsolete by the power takeoff tractor. He did not use Nora's name. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew which 60-acre operation on Cedar Ridge Road he was describing. 200 people knew. He said that the individual in question had made a decision based on what he was willing to characterize as emotional attachment to a family tradition, rather than sound commercial judgment. He said he hoped the individual would reconsider before the 1978 season, because the pest pressure implications of an unsprayed floor in a commercial orchard were not theoretical. They were documented, and they were serious, and they would manifest in the harvest numbers within 18 months. He finished and stepped back from the podium, and a man in the second row started to applaud, and the room followed. Then Roy Callahan stood up from his chair in the fourth row. He was not on the program. He had not asked to speak. But the room knew Roy Callahan, and the room quieted when he stood. Because Roy Callahan was not a man who stood up in public meetings without something to say that people would listen to. He turned slightly so that he was addressing both Gerald Pfeiffer and the room at once. He said that he had visited the Halverson place the previous Monday morning. He said he had known Eric Halverson for 20 years and had known Nora Halverson for 15, and that he had the greatest personal respect for her and for the difficult circumstances she was managing. He said that in his professional judgment as a 140-acre commercial orchardist, the decision to place free-range poultry in a commercial apple block and phase out the Guthien program represented a significant departure from sound horticultural practice. He said he believed the decision had been made under conditions of grief and isolation, and that he hoped the Grant County orchard community would continue to extend its support to the Halverson family as the consequences of the decision became apparent. He said all of this in a voice of measured, careful concern. Then he sat down. Nobody in the room laughed. It was not that kind of moment. It was quieter than laughter. It was the sound of 200 people deciding in unison and without discussion that a question had been settled. In the back row, Nora Halverson sat with her small green accounting book in her lap and a pencil in her right hand. She had been sitting in the back row since 6:50. She had not spoken. She had not raised her hand during the comment period. She had written 2 things in the accounting book during Gerald Pfeiffer's presentation. She had written the page number of the section in the 1872 manual that addressed organophosphate resistance in the European apple moth complex. And she had written the year 1974, which was the year the unpublished Washington State University entomology data that she had been corresponding with a county extension intern about had first begun to show reduced Guthien response in the codling moth populations of the upper Wenatchee Valley. When Roy Callahan sat down, the room began to move on. The coffee service opened at the back. People stood and stretched and turned to the people beside them. Nora closed the accounting book and picked up her coat from the seat beside her. She stood. She walked to the end of the row. She walked up the aisle toward the rear exit, which was the direction that took her past the fourth row, where Roy Callahan was sitting with his hand resting on his knee and his eyes following the room. He did not look at her as she passed, or he tried not to. She did not stop. At the door, with her hand on the metal push bar, she paused. The room was loud now with the sound of 200 people moving toward coffee and conversation. She turned halfway toward the room, not looking at anyone in particular, looking at the space just above the heads of the people in the front rows. And she said in a voice that was not loud, but that carried the clarity of a sentence that has been held in a person for a long time and is finally being released, that the coddling moth did not care what the consensus was. Then she pushed through the door and walked into the November cold of the parking lot and drove home on the county road with the heater running and the window cracked and the 60 acres of Cedar Ridge Road waiting for her in the dark. She parked the truck at the gate and walked across the gravel yard to the kitchen door. She hung her coat on the hook behind the door. She put the kettle on. She took the 1872 manual from the second shelf of the pantry and set it on the kitchen table and opened it to page 63. She read the section again slowly, the way she read it when she needed to remember. Not just the number, but the woman behind the number. Svenine Halvorsen had sat at a table somewhere in western Norway in 1872 and written down what she had seen in her orchard for 17 years. And she had done it with a precision and a patience that had survived 105 years. And an ocean crossing and had ended up on a kitchen table on Cedar Ridge Road in Grant County, Washington, under the hands of a woman who had made a decision that 200 people in the Wenatchee Valley Convention Center had just spent the better part of an evening deciding was a mistake. Nora read the section once more. She read the sentence about the 84% reduction. She looked at the number for a long time. Outside in the upper home orchard, 260 buff Orpington hens were settled in the portable coop shelters that Earl had helped her position along the lower fence line, and the lead hen with the B3 leg band was on the roosting bar in the first shelter. And the November cold was pressing itself down through the cedar ridge and into the orchard floor, where the coddling moth cocoons were spinning themselves into the bark crevices and the leaf litter, and waiting for spring. The way they had waited for spring every year for longer than anyone had been keeping records. They did not know what was coming for them. They had never encountered what was coming for them. Everything that was about to happen to them had been written down in Norwegian in 1872 by a woman who had understood something that the entire Washington state commercial apple industry had decided. In a conference room in Wenatchee did not need to be understood. Nora closed the manual. She set her pencil down on the table beside it. She listened to the kettle begin to sound on the stove. She listened to the wind in the upper orchard. She was 35 years old, and she had $192 less than she had had 3 weeks ago, and a flock of 260 birds that the most respected agricultural authority in Grant County had just told 200 people she should have known better than to buy, and a son asleep upstairs and 60 acres of ground that she was going to farm, the way Svenine Halvorsen had farmed her ground in 1872. Not because it was easy, or because anyone was going to help her, but because she had read the number on page 63 4 times, and she trusted it more than she trusted anything Gerald Pfeiffer had ever said at a podium. She got up and poured her tea. She took the accounting book from her jacket pocket and set it on the table next to the manual. She opened it to a fresh page. At the top of the page, she wrote the date, October 22nd, 1977. Below that, she wrote the number 260. Below that, she wrote the number 84, with a percent sign after it. Below that, she wrote the number she was aiming for, and the year she was aiming for it. She looked at what she had written. Then she turned off the overhead light and carried her tea to the window and stood in the dark looking out at the upper orchard where the birds were sleeping in the cold. And the whole county had already decided what was going to happen next. They were wrong about everything that mattered. The first harvest came in November of 1977 on the partially converted northern spy block that Nora had not yet had time to phase out of its old spray schedule entirely. The coddling moth pressure that year ran at 24% crop loss across the Halvorsen ground against a Grant County commercial average of 19. She had expected this. The 1872 manual was clear on the point. The birds needed a full dormant season to work the overwintering cocoon population down to manageable levels. 1 season of scratching was not enough. 2 seasons would show a measurable difference. 3 seasons would show something the Extension Office could not explain away. She wrote the 24% figure in the green accounting book on the 3rd Sunday of November. Sitting at the kitchen table with the Monroe adding machine her father-in-law had bought in 1957, cranked once to confirm the arithmetic she had already done in her head. She wrote it without comment and turned to the next page and began projecting the 1978 figures based on the flock density and the rotational coverage she had achieved in the first 6 weeks. Caleb was at the kitchen table across from her, doing his arithmetic homework, which was something Nora had always taken quietly as a good sign that the boy did his numbers at the same table where she did hers. Roy Callahan heard about the 24% figure before the end of November. He heard it at the Grant County Co-op on a Wednesday morning from Earl Voss, who had not volunteered the information, but had answered honestly when Roy asked him directly. Roy drove home and told his wife, Ruth, that it was going exactly the way Gerald Pfeiffer had said it would go. Ruth set a plate of biscuits on the table and said that one season was not a conclusion. Roy said that 24% was 24%. Ruth said that Nora Halverson had read something nobody else in this county had bothered to read, and that a woman who had read something carefully was not the same as a woman who had made a mistake. Roy ate his biscuits and did not answer her. The winter of 1977 to 1978 was the first full dormant season the Buff Orpington flock worked the Halverson orchard floor. Nora had positioned the 4 mobile coop shelters along the lower fence line of the upper home orchard, and she moved them on a 4-week rotational cycle through the 60 acres. As the manual prescribed, pulling them on the small wagon wheel frames that she and Earl had built in the equipment shed in November, from materials she had ordered from the Quincy lumber yard. The birds scratched through the leaf litter and the lower bark crevices in the cold, and they found the overwintering cocoons, and they consumed them with the steady, unhurried efficiency of animals doing what their bodies had been shaped over centuries to do. Nora recorded the flock movement and the scratch coverage and the estimated duff disturbance depth in the green accounting book on the 3rd Sunday of every month, in the same careful hand her great-great-grandmother had used in a farmhouse in Loftus, Norway, 106 years before. The 1978 harvest came in at 18% crop loss. The Grant County commercial average that year was 19. The Halverson orchard had come in for the first time below the county average. The number was not dramatic. It was not the kind of number that got written up in the Wenatchee world. It was the kind of number that a careful person wrote down in a green accounting book and sat with for a long time on a Sunday evening, understanding what it meant, even if no one else did yet. Nora did not tell anyone about the 18% figure. Not Earl, not the bank, not the extension office. She wrote it down and she turned the page and she began planning the 1979 rotation cycle. The 1979 harvest came in at 13%. The Grant County average that year was 18. The Halverson orchard was now 5 points below the county average and trending in a direction that the 1872 manual had predicted to within 3 percentage points of its documented Loftus results. Nora wrote the 13% figure in the accounting book, and she looked at it for a long time. She allowed herself on that particular Sunday evening in November of 1979, something she had not allowed herself since October of 1977. Which was the specific, quiet pleasure of a person who has read something carefully and trusted it and been proven right by the ground itself. She did not share this pleasure with anyone. She closed the accounting book and put it on the second shelf of the pantry and went to check on Caleb, who was 13 years old and had recently begun spending his evenings in the equipment shed, with Earl learning the mechanical side of the orchard operation, in the way that boys on farming properties learn those things by being present and asking questions and being handed tools and making small mistakes that nobody made a big matter of. It was in January of 1980 that the first serious test came. The night of January 8th began quietly. The temperature had been dropping since sundown, and by 9 in the evening the thermometer on the north wall of the equipment shed read 4 below zero. Nora had checked the portable coop shelters at dusk, and the birds were settled. and the heater units in the two main shelters were running properly. She had gone to bed at 10:30 with no particular worry. She woke at 2:15 in the morning to a sound she could not immediately identify. It was not the wind which she knew by its pattern against the north windows. It was not the equipment shed which had its own set of sounds. It was a sound from the upper orchard, irregular and wrong in a way that pulled her out of sleep with the alertness of a person who has been listening to a piece of ground for long enough to know when something on it has changed. She put on her field jacket and her boots and took the flashlight from the kitchen shelf and went out into the dark. The temperature hit her at the door like a wall. She walked up through the lower orchard to the upper fence line and through the gate, and what she found there was this: the wire on the east side of the number 2 coop shelter had been pulled back from the bottom frame, and a family of coyotes, or possibly a pair of foxes. She would never be entirely certain which had worked their way through the gap and into the shelter, and into the adjacent free-range night zone, and had done in the space of perhaps 2 hours what predators do when they find themselves inside a fence with 60 birds in the dark. She counted by flashlight, and then counted again by the light of the lantern she had gone back to the equipment shed to retrieve. 58 birds dead or too badly injured to recover. 58 out of 260. She moved the survivors into the 2 intact shelters and reinforced the gap in the wire with the staple gun she kept in the equipment shed, and she spent the rest of the night in the upper orchard in the cold, sitting on an upturned bucket inside the number 1 shelter with the lantern on the ground between her feet, listening to the remaining birds settle. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, she had lost a full fifth of her flock. She had started with 260 birds. She had 202. At 7:15 in the morning, the telephone rang in the farmhouse. It was the loan officer at the Quincy branch of the Columbia Basin Savings Bank, a man named Dale Thurston, who had been Eric's contact at the bank since 1969, and who had inherited Nora's account when Eric died. Dale Thurston was a careful, methodical man who was not unkind, but who was also not in a position to separate the professional obligation of a monthly account review from the personal discomfort of delivering unwelcome information to a woman who had buried her husband 18 months before the conversation they were currently having. He told her the December payment had cleared, but that the account balance was sitting at a level he wanted to discuss before the February statement cycle. He used the word concerning twice. He said he thought it might be worth sitting down together in the first week of February to talk through the operating projections for the 1980 season. Nora told him she would call him back. She set the receiver down on the hook. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands still on the telephone. Then she took her coat from the hook and went back out to the upper orchard. Earl Voss was at the east fence line when she arrived, looking at the damaged shelter wire, with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath showing in the cold. He had driven up the road from his place at first light and had come through the gate without being asked. He looked at the repair she had made in the night, and then looked at the ground around the shelter, which still held the evidence of what had happened in the dark, and he did not say anything for a long time. After a while, he said he could build a second wire perimeter around all 4 shelters over the next 2 weekends, a foot out from the primary fence low to the ground, which would stop a coyote or a fox from being able to work the bottom frame. He said it would cost maybe $40 in materials. He said he had the time. Nora looked at the damaged shelter, and then at the 202 remaining birds scratching in the morning cold of the upper orchard, as if nothing had happened in the night, which was something she found both remarkable and steadying about animals, that they did not spend time in the aftermath of a catastrophe reconstructing it. They simply continued. She told Earl to order the materials. He nodded and went to his truck. That evening, Caleb came home from school and ate dinner and did his homework, and then came to find Nora in the equipment shed, where she was working on the rotation schedule for the spring. He was 13 years old, and he had the quiet, watchful quality of a boy who had grown up in a house where things were not always explained, but were always eventually understood. He sat on the workbench beside the schedule she was drawing, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked her if she was sure, not about the wire or the shelter repair or the bank call. He was 13 years old, and he had heard all three through the walls of the farmhouse that morning, and he was asking about the thing underneath all of them. He was asking about the flock and the 1872 manual, and the protocol she had been running for 2 years and 3 months, while the county watched and waited for her to fail. Nora set her pencil down on the workbench. She looked at her son. She went to the second shelf of the equipment shed where she kept the field copy of the manual, the one she had made by hand in the winter of 1976, transcribed section by section into a wire-bound notebook. She opened it to the page that corresponded to page 63 of the original. She set it on the workbench in front of Caleb and put her finger on the number at the center of the page. She told him that his great-great-grandmother had measured that number in an orchard in western Norway between 1855 and 1872. She told him it had taken Svenine Halvorsen 17 years to be certain enough of it to write it down in the formal record. She told him that a woman who spends 17 years measuring something before she will commit it to a permanent document is not a woman who has made a mistake. She told him that 58 birds was a hard night and a harder morning, and that the bank would call again, and the county would keep watching, and that none of it changed what was on that page. Caleb looked at the number for a long time. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was thinking, rather than when he was uncertain. Then he slid down off the workbench and said he was going to go check on the birds in the number 3 shelter, because he wanted to make sure the heater unit was drawing properly. He took a flashlight from the hook by the shed door and went out into the dark. Nora stood alone in the equipment shed for a moment. She had not known until the boy asked the question, and she answered it how much she had needed to say those things out loud to someone. She went back to the rotation schedule on the workbench and picked up her pencil and kept working. In January of 1980, in Pullman, Washington, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Marsh sat at her desk in the entomology wing of the Washington State University Agricultural Sciences Building and read, for the third time, a brief, unsigned paragraph in the most recent Washington Cooperative Extension newsletter that described an unnamed Grant County orchardist running a documented integrated poultry biological control program with measurable codling moth pressure reduction across 3 consecutive harvest seasons. The paragraph had been written by a county extension intern who had heard about the Halvorsen operation through the 3-cent classifieds network and had driven out to Cedar Ridge Road in November to ask Nora a set of questions that Nora had answered with the same economy and precision she brought to everything. The intern had written the paragraph and submitted it, and had not thought particularly more about it. Dr. Sylvia Marsh thought a great deal more about it. She was 44 years old and had been running a research program on biological control protocols against the codling moth complex for 11 years. She had published 8 papers. She had applied for 3 grants focused on integrated pest management approaches and had received 2 of them. She had been tracking the entomological data on Guthyon response rates in the upper Wenatchee Valley since 1974, when the first anomalous pheromone trap counts had started to appear in the unpublished data her graduate students were pulling from the Commercial Orchard Monitoring Network. The data was not yet at a level that would pass peer review as a resistance confirmation, but it was moving in a direction that anyone who had been looking at organophosphate resistance curves in other moth complexes in other parts of the country would have recognized immediately. She wrote Nora Halverson a letter on January 17, 1980. She introduced herself and her research program. She described what she had read in the newsletter and what it had suggested to her about the Halverson operation. She asked whether Nora would consider a multi-year collaborative research arrangement in which Dr. Marsh and her graduate students would visit the orchard during the growing season to document the pheromone trap pressure curves, the flock rotational protocol, the heritage variety yield data, and the integrated economic performance of the operation. She said she would keep all identifying information out of any publications that resulted from the collaboration, unless Nora gave explicit written permission to include it. Nora read the letter twice at the kitchen table on the morning it arrived. She read it a third time that evening. She replied 4 weeks later. She said yes to the collaboration, and she said one thing clearly in the reply letter written in her spare, deliberate hand on the good stationery she kept in the kitchen drawer for correspondence that mattered. She wrote, "Publish the data, not my name." Dr. Marsh kept her word. She visited the Halverson orchard every May, June, July, August, and September from 1980 through 1986. She set pheromone traps in the northern Spy and Newtown Pippin and Roxbury russet blocks in the spring and read them on a weekly schedule through the growing season. She documented the flock rotation cycles and the duff disturbance depth and the estimated cocoon population density in the pre-scratch and post-scratch quadrant surveys. She measured what Nora was doing with the precision of a scientist, and she wrote it down with the thoroughness of a researcher who understood that the data she was gathering might eventually be the most important data in her career. Between 1982 and 1986, she published 6 papers in the Journal of Economic Entomology and Integrated Pest Management Quarterly, each of them referencing the Halverson operation only as Cooperator H. No one in Grant County identified Cooperator H until the summer of 1983. The 1980 harvest came in at 9% crop loss. The county average that year was 17. The gap between the Halverson operation and the standard commercial orchards of Grant County had widened to 8 percentage points in 4 seasons. Nora wrote the 9% figure in the accounting book on the 3rd Sunday of November. She wrote it in the same hand she always used without underlining or emphasis, and she looked at it for a while and then closed the book and put it on the shelf. Earl Voss had seen the flock grow in the spring of 1980 through the first successful natural hatch on the Halverson place. Nora had set 4 broody hens in the hatching boxes in late March, and she had attended the hatch on the morning of April 23rd, kneeling in the fresh wood shavings for 2 hours and 40 minutes until the first chick emerged from under the lead broody hen. She held it in her palm and checked its color in the light coming through the equipment shed window, and she named it Sigrid, after the woman who had brought the 1872 manual across the Atlantic. Earl Voss stood in the shed doorway and watched her do this, and he did not say anything. He understood enough by then not to need to. The 1981 harvest came in at 5%. The county average was 16. In November of 1981, Gerald Pfeiffer gave his annual presentation to the Washington State Horticultural Association for the 15th time in 17 years. He talked about the Gutheion schedule and the pre-harvest cleanup applications and the herbicide timing for the 1982 season. He did not talk about Cooperator H. He did not talk about the pheromone trap data that Dr. Sylvia Marsh's graduate students had been pulling from the upper Wenatchee Valley monitoring network since 1978. Data that had not yet been formally published as a resistance confirmation, but that was sitting in peer review at the Journal of Economic Entomology in a paper that would be accepted for publication in the spring of 1982. Gerald Pfeiffer did not know about that paper. He had not been asked to peer review it. He had not been asked because Dr. Marsh had submitted it to a journal whose editorial board did not routinely draw from the Washington State University Extension Program, which was not an accident. He did in the last 10 minutes of his 1981 presentation. Return briefly to the subject he had addressed in his 1977 presentation. He said that the integrated poultry approach had now had 4 seasons to demonstrate its commercial viability in at least one Grant County operation, and that the harvest data available to him showed that the operation in question was running below the county average on crop loss, but that the per-acre revenue was not comparable to a standard commercial Red Delicious operation, because the heritage variety conversion had not yet produced a working commercial market relationship. He said this in the measured voice of a man who believes he is being fair. He said it in a room full of people who had mostly stopped thinking about the Halverson orchard on a daily basis, but who had not stopped having an opinion about it. He said the situation remained one to observe. 4 people in the room recognized the specific quality of that statement, the way it managed to acknowledge a data point while simultaneously diminishing its significance. And those 4 people were all women, and none of them said anything. And Gerald Pfeiffer moved on to herbicide timing. The 1982 harvest came in at 4% crop loss on the Halverson ground. The county average was 15. Nora had, by the autumn of 1982, grafted out all 60 acres of the original Red Delicious to heritage varieties. The Northern Spy Block ran 20 acres. The Newtown Pippin ran 22. The Roxbury Russet ran 18. The Buff Orpington flock had been expanded through 3 consecutive years of natural hatch to 480 laying hens and 32 breeding roosters. She had built 2 additional mobile coop shelters with Earl in the spring of 1981, using the same hand-cut large frame construction as the originals. The double-wire perimeter Earl had built in January 1980 had held against every predator approach in the subsequent 3 years. On a cold evening in October of 1982, Nora and Earl Voss sat on the back step of the farmhouse after evening chores with their enamel mugs between them. Caleb was inside doing his senior year homework. The orchard was dark and still around them. Earl set his mug on the step and said he had been thinking. He said he had been working on this ground since the spring of 1976, and he had been watching what she was doing with it since the autumn of 1977. And he thought he had understood it by about 1980. But that understanding something and knowing it were different things, and he wanted to say that he knew it now. He said the orchard was right. He said he was sorry he had not said so sooner. Nora held her coffee mug in both hands and looked at the dark line of the upper orchard against the October sky. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that he had said it in October of 1977, the morning he helped her walk 260 birds off a borrowed stock trailer into the upper orchard without telling her she was making a mistake. She said that was when he had said it. He just had not used words. Earl was quiet for a while. Then he said he wanted her to know that whatever happened next, he would be there for it. Nora said she knew that. They finished their coffee in the dark, and Earl went to his truck, and Nora went inside and wrote the 1982 figures in the accounting book, and sat for a long time at the kitchen table looking at what 6 years of numbers looked like when you put them in a column. 24, 18, 13, 9, 5, 4. She had not told Earl what she believed was about to happen next, which was the thing her great-grandmother Sigrid had repeated on the kitchen porch of the home place from the time Nora was 5 years old. She had not told him because she had not needed to. The numbers told it well enough for anyone who was willing to read them. The spring of 1983 was the spring that the codling moth resistance data finally became impossible to ignore. The Washington State University Tree Fruit Research and Extension Center in Wenatchee had been running its commercial orchard pheromone trap monitoring program since 1971. The program involved placing standardized pheromone traps in a network of commercial orchards across Chelan, Douglas, and Grant counties in early April each year, and reading them on a weekly schedule through the growing season. The trap counts provided a running estimate of adult codling moth population pressure and were the primary basis for spray timing recommendations across the commercial orchard belt. In the spring of 1983, the April trap counts came in wrong. Not wrong in the way that counts occasionally ran high in a bad weather year or a late spring. Wrong in the way that a number is wrong when the system that was supposed to prevent it from ever being that number has stopped working. The early May counts across 87% of the monitored commercial orchards were running at a factor of 4 above the historical baseline. The research center's entomology team had never seen numbers like them in the 12 years of the program's operation. Dr. Sylvia Marsh had seen numbers trending in this direction since 1978. She had published the first formal documentation of reduced Guthien response in the Wenatchee Valley codling moth population in her 1982 Journal of Economic Entomology paper. The paper had attracted attention within the academic entomology community and had been cited twice in other journals. It had not attracted significant attention in Grant County because the paper had been read by researchers and not by extension agents or commercial growers, and the data in it had been collected from research plots rather than from commercial orchard blocks, and the commercial orchard community had been assured for 22 years that the Guthien program was holding. It had stopped holding. The Tree Fruit Research and Extension Center convened an emergency committee in the first week of May, 1983. The committee included 3 entomologists, 2 extension specialists, and a biometrician who had been running the trap monitoring data since 1974. They met for 3 days. They reviewed every trap count on record. They reviewed the spray application logs from 20 commercial orchards. They reviewed the unpublished resistance trend data that 2 of the 3 entomologists had been tracking in their own research programs and had not until this meeting been willing to formally characterize as a confirmed resistance event. On the morning of May 23, 1983, the Tree Fruit Research and Extension Center released an emergency advisory bulletin. The bulletin confirmed that the standard organophosphate spray program built around azinphos methyl was failing across the Wenatchee Valley commercial orchard belt. It confirmed that codling moth populations were testing resistant in 87% of sampled commercial orchards. It projected 1983 harvest losses of 35 to 60% across Chelan and Grant counties. It recommended that commercial growers immediately add a second mid-cycle imidine application and a third pre-harvest malathion cleanup application to the standard spray protocol for the 1983 season, which was a recommendation that translated in practical terms to a significant increase in input cost for an event that had already happened and could not be corrected by adding more applications of the chemistry that had failed. The bulletin was read at an emergency meeting of the Grant County commercial orchard operators at the Extension office on the afternoon of May 23rd. There were approximately 40 people in the room. Gerald Pfeiffer stood at the front of the room and read the bulletin's key findings in the measured professional voice he had spent 17 years developing for exactly the kinds of difficult conversations that arise in an extension office, when the system you have been recommending has produced an outcome you did not anticipate. He read the 87% figure. He read the 35 to 60% crop loss projection. He read the recommendation to add the supplemental imidine application. He read these things out loud to the 40 commercial apple operators of Grant County, and the room was very quiet while he read them. Roy Callahan was in the 4th row. He was 66 years old in the spring of 1983. He had been farming Red Delicious on the 140 acres above the Halverson place for 38 years. He listened to Gerald Pfeiffer read the bulletin, and he sat very still in his chair. He was the kind of man who had always been able to locate his certainties quickly, who had always known what he believed, and had always been willing to say it in a room. And now he was sitting in a folding metal chair in the Grant County Extension Office and listening to the professional consensus of 17 years dissolve, sentence by sentence, from a bulletin that the man who had been its most credentialed representative was now reading aloud in a voice that had gone careful in a new way. Careful not with authority. Careful with something Roy recognized after a moment as the carefulness of a man who is delivering a verdict he helped create without appearing to have built it. Gerald Pfeiffer reached the end of the bulletin. He set it down on the podium. He looked at the room. He said that the research center was fully committed to supporting commercial growers through the transition to supplemental applications, and that the Extension Office would be scheduling individual farm consultations beginning the following week. He said that resistance events of this nature were documented phenomena in long-running spray programs, and that the appropriate response was a strategic adjustment to the spray schedule, rather than a fundamental reassessment of the commercial production model. Roy Callahan looked at the man at the podium. He looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at the floor. He thought about the November evening in 1977, when he had stood in a room very much like this one and told 200 people that his neighbor's decision had been made under conditions of grief and poor judgment. He thought about the sentence he had used the phrase about sound horticultural practice. He thought about the 6 years of Sunday afternoons he had spent watching the Halverson orchard from the road above and telling himself that the numbers being reported at the co-op were anomalous or preliminary, or not comparable to a standard commercial operation. He thought about the 4% crop loss figure from the 1982 season which he had heard at the co-op in November, and had set aside in his mind under the category of things he would think about later. He thought about it now. He sat with it in the silence that belongs only to a man who has spent 6 years being wrong about something in public and has just been handed the specific and irreversible moment at which he is required to know it. Gerald Pfeiffer finished his remarks and opened the floor for questions. The questions came from around the room, practical and urgent about application timing and supplier availability and crop insurance implications. Gerald Pfeiffer answered them one by one in his careful, new voice. Roy Callahan did not ask a question. He sat in his chair through the entire discussion period, and he did not say a word, which was something that several people in the room noticed, because Roy Callahan had never been a man who sat through a discussion period without contributing to it. After the meeting, the parking lot filled and emptied in the way of parking lots after meetings where the news has been worse than expected. Trucks started and pulled out, and the gravel settled. Roy Callahan sat in his truck in the parking lot for 11 minutes after the last other vehicle had left. His wife Ruth would ask him later what he had been thinking in those 11 minutes, and he would tell her he had been trying to figure out where the last 6 years had gone and how they had taken his certainty with them when they left. He drove home on County Road 12. He drove past the top of Cedar Ridge Road. He did not turn down it. He went home and he sat at the kitchen table and Ruth put coffee in front of him, and he told her what the bulletin had said and what it meant for their 1983 season and what he thought it meant for everything else. Ruth listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she said one thing. She said that Nora Halverson's 4% was going to look different to this county in November than it had looked in November of any of the previous 6 years. Roy said he knew that. Ruth said she thought he ought to go over there. Roy said he was not ready, Ruth said she understood and poured herself coffee and sat down across from him, and they did not speak again for a long time. Outside, across the county in the standard commercial apple orchards of the Wenatchee Valley, the codling moth population that had been building resistance in the bark crevices and the leaf litter duff for 9 consecutive Guthian seasons was moving through the developing fruit of the 1983 harvest. It was doing what it had always done, what it had been shaped over 10,000 years. To do what no spray program devised in the previous 4 decades had ultimately succeeded in stopping it from doing. It was finding its way to the seeds at the center of the apple, which was the only thing it had ever been interested in, and the fact that this year the chemical that was supposed to prevent it from doing so had stopped working was not a problem that the moth was aware of or concerned with. 60 acres down Cedar Ridge Road in the Halverson orchard, the codling moth population was encountering a different situation. It had been encountering a different situation since the winter of 1977. The overwintering cocoon population in the bark crevices and the leaf litter duff of the Halverson ground had been reduced year over year for 6 consecutive dormant seasons by 480 buff Orpington hens working the understory on a 4-week rotational cycle, scratching for 10 hours a day through the cold months, finding the cocoons in the duff, and consuming them with the unhurried thoroughness of animals that had been doing exactly this in orchards in western Norway since before anyone now living had been born. The 1983 growing season moved toward August. The pheromone traps across Grant County commercial orchards continued to read high. The supplemental imidine application that Gerald Pfeiffer had recommended added cost and added residue, and did not add the result it was supposed to add, because the resistance that had built in the moth population over 9 seasons was not addressed by a mid-cycle supplemental application of a chemistry class the population had been adapting to since 1974. On the Halverson ground, the pheromone traps that Dr. Sylvia Marsh's graduate students had been reading since 1980 continued to read low in the way they had been reading since the second full dormant season of the Buff Orpington rotation. The summer of 1983 moved through its heat and into September, and then into the long gold light of the Wenatchee Valley in October, which is the light that arrives when the apple season is turning toward its end, and the valley fills with the smell of the harvest coming in. And you can tell from driving the county roads, if you know how to read an orchard, which operations are going to come in clean and which ones are not. If you drove Cedar Ridge Road in October of 1983, you could tell. The Washington State Department of Agriculture grading station in Wenatchee certified the Halverson harvest on the afternoon of October 11, 1983. The certification document was a standard 4-page form printed on buff-colored paper, with the state seal in the upper left corner, and lines for variety acreage, total weight, and grade distribution. The grade distribution line for the northern spy block read 94% grade 1. The Newtown Pippin block read 96%. The Roxbury Russet block read 97%. The aggregate certification across all 60 acres read 94% clean fruit. The grading station's supervisor, a man named Howard Paulson, who had been certifying Grant County harvests since 1967, looked at the Halverson numbers twice before he signed the form. He had certified every harvest from every commercial orchard in Grant County for 16 years, and he had never signed a certification form with aggregate numbers like these in a season like this one. He signed it and dated it and handed the carbon copy across the counter to Earl Voss, who had driven the first load in that morning in the flatbed. With Caleb riding beside him, and Earl took it and folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and said thank you and walked out to the truck. He drove back to Cedar Ridge Road without stopping. He pulled through the gate and parked in the gravel yard and found Nora in the lower orchard, running the last of the harvest bins to the loading area with the small tractor. He waited at the edge of the orchard until she had set the bin and shut the tractor down. Then he walked over and took the folded certification form from his jacket and handed it to her without saying anything. Nora unfolded it. She read the numbers. She read them again. She stood in the lower orchard in the October light, with the certification form in both hands, and the sound of the last harvest bins settling on the loading dock behind her. And she was very still for a long time. She had known the numbers were going to be good. She had been reading the pheromone traps with Dr. Marsh's graduate students all summer, and the counts had been running at the same low levels they had run since 1980. And she had known from the beginning of September that the harvest was going to come in clean. She had known it in the way she knew things about this ground now, not from hope or from wanting it to be true, but from 6 years of data written in a green accounting book on the second shelf of the kitchen pantry, and from a number on page 63 of a Norwegian manual that had been right every time she had trusted it. But knowing a thing in September and holding its documentation in your hands in October are different experiences, and Nora Halverson stood in the lower orchard with the state seal in the upper left corner of the form and the numbers across the middle of it, and she allowed herself the full weight of what she was holding. 6 years, $192 in October of 1977. A borrowed stock trailer, 260 birds walking down a ramp into an orchard that the most credentialed man in Grant County had told 200 people she had no business putting them into. She folded the form and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked up at the upper orchard where the buff Orpington flock was working the fall duff. In the long afternoon light, the deep golden birds moving through the understory beneath the northern spy trees, in the unhurried, continuous way they had been moving through it for 6 years. She watched them for a moment. Then she went back to the tractor and finished moving the last of the bins. The Wenatchee World ran the story on the front page of the October 12th edition. The headline was in the third column of the front page, below the fold. It read, "The 60-acre orchard the worms did not touch." The article was 8 column inches on the front page and continued for 12 more inside. It named the operation name Nora Halverson reported the 94% aggregate certification figure and ran it against the county-wide harvest data that showed a Grant County commercial average of 41% crop loss for the 1983 season. The morning the article ran, Nora was at the kitchen table at 5:30 with her coffee and her accounting book. Caleb was upstairs asleep. Earl Voss was not due until 7. She read the article once. She set the paper down on the table beside the accounting book. She drank her coffee. The telephone rang at 6:15. It was a wholesale packing house buyer out of Yakima named Douglas Fife, who had managed the Callahan account for 19 years, and who had spent the previous 4 days watching every commercial. Grant County wholesale lot come in with 25 to 50% reject grade fruit. He told Nora that the packing house was prepared to offer her a contract for any portion of the 1983 Heritage Variety surplus, at whatever price she was willing to name. He said this in the voice of a man who was not accustomed to being in the position of naming the other party's price, and who understood that he was in that position now, and was not in a position to pretend otherwise. Nora told him she would call him back. She set the receiver down. She did not call him back. The telephone rang again at 6:50. It was a man from the Grant County Extension Office asking if he could schedule a consultation visit. She told him she would think about it. She wrote his name in the margin of the accounting book page. The telephone rang 4 more times before Earl Voss pulled through the gate at 7:15. She did not answer the last 3. On the morning of October 15th, 4 days after the certification, and 3 days after the World article, a woman named Dorothy Howell called the Halverson number from Seattle. Dorothy Howell was 52 years old and had been operating a small specialty fruit and natural food shop at Pike Place Market since 1971. She was a compact, deliberate woman with reading glasses she kept on a cord around her neck and a working knowledge of Pacific Northwest agricultural economics that was considerably more detailed than most of her customers suspected. She had been looking for a certified chemical-free Washington Heritage apple supplier for 12 consecutive years. She had written letters to 14 orchards. She had driven over the Cascades 3 times to visit operations that had turned out on inspection to be hobby farms with commercial aspirations rather than commercial farms with a documented pest management protocol. She had read the Wenatchee World article in the Saturday edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer Regional Summary. She called on Tuesday morning. She introduced herself and described her shop and what she was looking for. She told Nora she was interested in a long-term supply relationship for heritage variety apples, produced without organophosphate chemistry, and that she was prepared to pay a premium price for certified clean fruit that she could represent honestly to her customers as what it actually was. She said she could be in Quincy by the following Saturday if Nora was willing to meet. Nora asked her what she considered a premium price. Dorothy Howell said she was thinking about $1.40 per pound at the wholesale level, with a minimum annual commitment of 120,000 pounds across the 3 heritage varieties, renewable on a 5-year contract basis. Nora was quiet for a moment. $1.40 per pound was 7 times the current commodity wholesale rate for Red Delicious. 120,000 pounds at that price was $168,000 annually. She had not told Dorothy Howell what the Callahan 140-acre Red Delicious operation grossed in a normal year. She did not need to. She knew the number. She had known it for years in the way that a person knows the arithmetic of the land adjacent to theirs. She told Dorothy Howell to come on Saturday. Dorothy Howell arrived at the Halverson Gate at 9:40 in the morning on October 22, 1983, in a 1982 silver Volvo station wagon with a small brown leather portfolio on the passenger seat and the folded contract inside it. She was wearing a wool coat and sensible boots, and she carried herself with the efficiency of a woman who had driven 3 hours over a mountain pass for a meeting she had been trying to arrange for 12 years and intended to conduct it without wasting either party's time. Nora met her at the gate and walked her through the upper home orchard first before they went inside. Dorothy Howell walked through the northern spy rows without speaking, looking at the understory, at the birds working the fall duff, at the condition of the fruit still hanging on the late-bearing trees at the upper end of the block. She stopped once and crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the leaf litter at the base of a northern spy tree and held it there for a moment. Then she stood and looked at Nora and said she had read about the Norwegian protocol in a food systems journal in 1979 and had been trying to find someone actually running it in the Pacific Northwest ever since. They went inside. Nora put coffee on. Dorothy Howell set the leather portfolio on the kitchen table and opened it and took out the contract and set it between them. It was 4 pages single-spaced on good paper. Nora read it the way she read everything completely and without rushing. She read it twice. She picked up a pencil from beside the accounting book on the table and wrote 2 questions in the margin of the second page, small and precise. She asked Dorothy Howell both questions. Dorothy answered them clearly and without hedging. Nora looked at the contract for a moment after the second answer. Then she picked up the pencil and signed it at 12:14 in the afternoon of October 22, 1983, which was 6 years to the day from the morning she had backed a borrowed stock trailer through the gate of the upper home orchard and walked 260 buff Orpington hens into a county that had already decided what was going to happen next. Dorothy Howell signed her copy. She put it back in the leather portfolio. She finished her coffee. They talked for another 40 minutes about logistics and delivery schedules and the second-year transition to organic certification, which Nora told her she intended to pursue under the new federal standards being developed. Dorothy Howell drove back to Seattle that evening. The first shipment left the Halverson orchard in the second week of November, 1983, in the flatbed truck with Earl Voss driving and Caleb riding beside him. The same configuration they had used to bring the first harvest load to the grading station 32 days before. What happened in Grant County in the weeks after the World article ran was not dramatic in the way that public reversals are sometimes dramatic. There were no apologies in the parking lot of the extension office. There were no retractions in the paper. The commercial apple operators of the Wenatchee Valley were dealing in October of 1983 with the practical and financial consequences of a 40% crop loss, which left little time or emotional bandwidth for public reassessment of prior certainties. The reassessment happened in the private spaces where reassessments of that kind always happen in farming communities at kitchen tables and on the back steps of equipment sheds, and in the cab of a truck parked on a county road looking at someone else's orchard. Gerald Pfeiffer did not come to Cedar Ridge Road in the autumn of 1983. He called the Halverson number once in November and left a message with Caleb, asking if Nora would be willing to meet with him and a small group from the extension office in the new year. Nora returned the call 3 weeks later and told him she would think about it. She was not hostile in the call. She was simply the same person she had always been, which was a person who did not do things on someone else's timeline when her own timeline had served her adequately. Carl Benton had been a mid-level tree fruit economic analyst at the Washington State Department of Agriculture since 1975. He was a careful, methodical man of 41 who kept organized files and wrote clear memos, and had never in 8 years in the office had occasion to formally revisit a recommendation he had made. In the first week of November 1983, he went to the filing cabinet on the 3rd floor of the Olympia office where the Grant County Apple Operations folder was kept, and he found behind the 1982 seasonal summary the memo he had typed in November of 1977. He read it. He read the language he had used, the phrase likely operational failure and the phrase voluntary sale within 36 months. And the recommendation for an 18-month review. He set the memo down on his desk and looked at it for a while. Then he went to the 1983 seasonal data that had come in from the Grant County grading station, and he pulled the Halverson certification form and the accompanying yield records, and he put them on his desk beside the 1977 memo. He sat there for a long time. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures, which was why what he did next had the weight it had. He typed a 1-page formal memorandum to the Director of Agriculture on the department letterhead in the measured professional language that the department used for internal correspondence. He stated in the first paragraph that he was writing to formally correct a recommendation he had entered into the Grant County Apple Operations file in November of 1977. He described the original recommendation and its stated rationale. He described the 1983 certification data and what it represented in the context of the valley-wide resistance event. He wrote in the final paragraph that the analysis he had entered in 1977 had been incorrect in its assumptions, incorrect in its projections, and incorrect in its characterization of the operation's commercial viability, and that the record should reflect this correction. He attached the 1977 memo to the back of the new document. He walked the file to the director's office and set it on the desk. He went back to his own office and sat down and opened the next file on his stack and went back to work. The director read it. He called Carl Benton into his office the following afternoon. He asked him 2 questions. Benton answered both. The director said he wanted a full case study written for the 1984 annual report. Benton said he would write it. He wrote it over the course of December 1983 and January 1984. It ran 5 pages in the 1984 Washington State Department of Agriculture Annual Report under the heading The Quiet Resistance on Cedar Ridge Road. It documented the Halverson operation from October 1977 through the 1983 harvest certification, including the pheromone trap data from Dr. Marsh's research program, the year-by-year crop loss figures from the Halverson accounting records, and the economic comparison between the Halverson per acre net and the Grant County Commercial Red Delicious average for the same period. The case study is still in the Washington State Department of Agriculture archive in Olympia. Carl Benton called Nora Halverson directly on the morning he completed the first draft of the case study, which was a Friday in mid-December. He identified himself in his office. He told her what he was writing and why. He read her the corrective paragraph from his November memorandum. To the director, the paragraph where he had formally acknowledged that his 1977 analysis had been wrong. He read it all the way through without stopping. When he finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Nora said she appreciated him calling. She said she would be willing to review the case study for factual accuracy before it went to the director for final approval. Benton said he would send it. He did. She returned it with 4 small corrections in pencil, all of them factual and none of them concerning the conclusions. He incorporated all 4. He sent the final version to the director in the second week of January 1984. Roy Callahan's 1983 harvest had come in at 41% crop loss at the November grading. He had been farming Red Delicious for 38 years, and he had never had a season like it. The financial impact was significant and manageable, which was the difference between Roy Callahan and some of the smaller operators in the county, because Roy had always run conservative debt and had always kept a margin against bad years, which was something his father had told him to do in 1951, and which he had never stopped doing. The 41% crop loss did not threaten the Callahan operation, but it sat in him in a way that the numbers from 20 years of normal seasons had never sat, because it was connected in his mind to a set of other numbers. Numbers from a green accounting book he had never seen, but which had been reported at the co-op every November for 6 years, and which he had spent 6 years finding reasons not to fully reckon with. He spent the winter of 1983 to 1984 doing the kind of thinking that a man does when the structure he has built his certainties around has been tested in a way it did not hold up to. He did not talk about it much. Ruth understood this and left him to it. He drove past Cedar Ridge Road on his way to the co-op and on his way back, and he did not turn down it. He drove past the Halverson Upper Orchard and looked at it from the road in the way he had been looking at it since 1977. But the looking was different now. He was not looking at something he expected to fail. He was looking at something he had spent 6 years dismissing, that had turned out to be the only operation in the county that had come in clean in the worst resistance year in Wenatchee Valley history. And the looking had the quality of a man who is trying to understand how he managed to be wrong about something for so long, when the evidence was accumulating in front of him the entire time. He arrived at Cedar Ridge Road on a cold Saturday afternoon in late November, 1984. He had thought about the visit for the better part of a year. He parked his truck at the gate and walked through. He walked across the gravel yard to the upper orchard, where he could see Nora moving between the coop shelters with her tally book. She saw him come through the gate. She closed the tally book and walked down to the yard. Roy Callahan took off his faded green International Harvester cap and held it against his chest. He was 67 years old, and he had the weathered, careful look of a man who had spent a year thinking about what he was going to say when this moment came, and had not been entirely satisfied with any of the versions he had rehearsed. He told Nora that he had spent the past year thinking about Eric and about what he should have said in October of 1977, when she walked the first birds into the upper orchard. He told her he knew it now. He told her he should have known it by the autumn of 1980, when her coddling moth counts came in below his for the first time, and that he had not known it, because he was the kind of man he was, which was the kind of man who confused a long record of being right about most things with a permanent license to be right about all things. He told her he was not asking forgiveness. He told her he was asking if he could come stand at her gate on a Saturday afternoon and learn what he should have learned in 1977. Nora unlatched the gate. She held it open. She told him he was forgiven. She told him he had been forgiven on the evening Ruth had sent him over to the farmhouse in October of 1977, and that he had not needed to wait until a resistance crisis arrived to receive it. Roy said he had needed to come today. He said some reckonings needed to be made in person regardless of whether the other party required it. Nora said that was fair. She told him to come walk the orchard. He came in. They walked the upper home orchard for an hour in the late November light. Roy walked through the northern spy rows and looked at the understory and at the birds and at the condition of the ground. He stopped at the base of a mature northern spy tree and crouched down and looked at the leaf litter the way a man looks at something he is trying to read. He stood and looked at the row ahead of him. He asked Nora how long the rotational cycle ran. She told him 4 weeks per quadrant through the dormant season. He asked her what the Duff disturbance depth averaged after a full rotation cycle. She told him approximately 4 inches in a mature leaf litter layer. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked her if she would show him the accounting records. She did not show him the full accounting book. She took him to the kitchen and put coffee on and opened the book to the crop loss page, the page with the single column of figures running from 1977 through 1983. She set it on the table in front of him. He read the column. He read it again. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he had known about the 18% figure in 1978 and the 13 in 1979, and that he had told himself both times that it was not a comparable data point because the heritage varieties had a different susceptibility profile than Red Delicious. He said he had known about the 9% in 1980, and he had told himself the same thing. He said he had no explanation for why he had kept telling himself the same thing, when the gap between her numbers and his was widening every year, except that it was easier to dismiss a data point than to revise a conclusion you had stated publicly in front of 200 people. Nora poured coffee. She set a cup in front of him. She sat down across the table. She told him that she understood that. She told him she had read a sentence in a 1872 Norwegian manual 17 times before she trusted it enough to spend $192 on it, and that reading something once and trusting it were entirely different kinds of work. Roy held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the accounting book page. He said he was going to go home and tell Ruth about this conversation. He said Ruth had been telling him to have it for 6 years. Nora said she knew that. Roy looked at her. He asked her how she knew. She said that Ruth Callahan was a woman who kept her own counsel except when she believed something mattered enough to say it out loud, and that she had said it out loud to Nora on 3 separate occasions at the Lutheran church. and at the Orchard Supply and once in the Quincy post office, and that each time she had said it, Nora had been grateful. Roy set the cup down on the table. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was going to need some time to figure out what came next. He said he was 67 years old, and he was not going to convert 140 acres of mature red delicious overnight. And he was not going to pretend he understood a rotational poultry protocol after one Saturday afternoon. But he said he would come back next Saturday if she would let him. He said he wanted to understand it properly, not quickly. Nora said he could come back next Saturday. He came back the following Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. He came back 4 Saturdays in a row in November and December of 1984. And then through the winter and into the spring. And by the time the 1985 growing season opened, he had been coming to Cedar Ridge Road on Saturday afternoons long enough that it had become the kind of arrangement that both families understood without discussing it. Ruth packed him a small thermos of coffee for the drive down. He always brought it back empty. On the Saturday evening of November 28, 1984, Roy Callahan sat at his kitchen table with his hands around a fresh cup of coffee and told Ruth what he was going to do. He told her he had been thinking about the 80 acres on the Halverson east boundary. The 80 acres he had been carrying as a buffer parcel since 1969 and had never developed because it faced north and had a drainage problem on the lower third. He told her he was going to revise his will to transfer those 80 acres to Nora Halverson at no cost at the time of his death, so that the integrated poultry operation could expand without having to negotiate a real estate transaction with his estate. He said he was doing it because it was the right thing to do, and because it was the only way he could think of to make a concrete and permanent acknowledgement of what the Halverson ground had been quietly demonstrating for 6 years, while he had been standing above it on the county road deciding it was not worth taking seriously. Ruth Callahan set down her mending. She looked at her husband across the kitchen table. She said that was the first genuinely decent thing she had heard come out of his mouth since the night she had sent him over to the Halverson farmhouse in October of 1977. Roy said he was aware of that. She said she hoped he was going to keep finding ways to be decent on this subject, because she thought there were several more years of it available to him if he applied himself. Roy said he intended to try. Ruth picked her mending back up. Roy revised the will the following week on a Thursday afternoon at the office of his attorney in Quincy. The attorney asked him no questions about the reasoning behind the bequest, which Roy appreciated. The Wenatchee World ran a second feature on the Halverson operation in its November 27, 1984 edition. It ran 12 column inches on the front page and continued for 18 more inside. The headline read, "The 240 hens that outlived the spray program." The reporter had spoken to Earl Voss, to Dorothy Howell, to Dr. Sylvia Marsh at WSU, and to Augustus Callahan Roy's older brother, who had bought Northern Spy Budwood off Gunnar Halverson in the 1950s, and who was now 81 years old, and had something to say about it. Earl Voss was quoted saying he had known the orchard was right by 1980, and that he was sorry he had waited until a resistance crisis arrived to say so out loud. Augustus Callahan was quoted saying that he had known Gunnar Halverson and had known Sigrid Halverson, and that the granddaughter was what the grandmother was, and what the grandmother was had been the most careful orchardist in 3 Wenatchee Valley counties, and that he was sorry he had not said so in the fall of 1977, when it might have mattered more. Dr. Sylvia Marsh was quoted saying that her research program had been collaborating with the Halverson operation since January of 1980, and that Mrs. Halverson had asked her to keep the operation out of the published literature by name, and that she had honored that request, and that she was no longer going to honor it because the work deserved to be known by the name of the person who had done it. She said, The Halverson Orchard was the founding reference in the integrated poultry biological control literature for the Pacific Northwest, and that it had been quietly operated for 6 years by a single Grant County widow on 260 birds. Her great-grandmother's manual had told her to acquire. She said there was no research program she had ever been associated with that had taught her more about the relationship between patient observation and sound science than the 6 years she had spent at Cedar Ridge Road with a pheromone trap and a notepad. Roy Callahan was quoted at the end of the article. He said one sentence. He said he owed his neighbor his respect and that he intended to spend whatever time he had left trying to deserve to call her his friend. The article did not note, because Nora had not mentioned it to the reporter, that the hand-bound 1872 Norwegian agricultural manual her great-great-grandmother had carried across the Atlantic in a birchwood box was still in use in the Halverson kitchen pantry in 1984. That the 4 mobile coop shelters Svenine Halverson had described in the manual's hand-drawn appendix had been the operational foundation of every rotation cycle on the Halverson ground since October of 1977. That the number on page 63, the 84% reduction figure that Svenine had measured in the Loftus family orchard between 1855 and 1872, had been matched to within 3 percentage points across 6 years of measurement by Dr. Marsh's graduate students on 60 acres in Grant County, Washington. 111 years after it had first been written down in a farmhouse in western Norway, by a woman who had spent 17 years making sure she was certain enough of it to commit it to a permanent record. By the spring of 1992, the Halverson Orchard had become the founding reference in the expanding American integrated pest management movement. 57 working Pacific Northwest and Northern California and Hudson Valley heritage apple orchards had adopted variations of the Halverson rotational mobile coop protocol between 1985 and 1995. 12 of those 57 had gone on to obtain organic certification under the federal organic standards adopted in 1990. The Washington State Department of Agriculture established in 1993 a permanent Washington Integrated Pest Management Foundation Award named for Sigrid Halverson, the woman who had packed the 1872 manual in a birchwood box in Loftus, Norway, and carried it west to the Wenatchee Valley in 1908. Washington State University established in 1995 a small-scale integrated poultry orchard certificate program with Dr. Sylvia Marsh as its founding director. Earl Voss stayed with the operation for the rest of his working life. He became the senior orchard manager in March of 1984, and he managed the Northern Spy and Newtown Pippin blocks through the complete organic transition that Nora completed under federal certification in 1991. He retired in 2001 at the age of 73 and came back 3 weeks later as a volunteer for the spring grafting season, which had always been his favorite part of the year, and which he continued to help with on an informal basis until the spring of 2008. Caleb Halverson earned his degree in horticulture from Washington State University in 1989 and returned to the home place in 1991. He was 25 years old when he came back, and he had the same watchful, unhurried quality he had always had, the quality of a person who had grown up in a house where things were done carefully and with attention, and who had absorbed that approach so completely that it was no longer a habit, but simply the way he moved through the world. He took on the orchard management side of the operation, and Nora focused on the chicken rotation protocol and the heritage variety grafting program. And between them, they ran the 60 acres in the same way it had been run since 1977, without debt and without shortcuts, and with the green accounting book reconciled on the kitchen table on the 3rd Sunday of every month. Caleb married a food systems researcher from Wenatchee named Astrid Holbrook in 1995. They had 2 daughters. The younger daughter was born in 1999, and they named her Sigrid for the woman who had brought the manual west in 1908. In 2003, when Sigrid was 4 years old, Caleb and Astrid brought her out to the upper orchard for the first time on a Saturday morning in April and set her down in the understory among the buff Orpington hens, and she stood very still for a moment, watching them scratch, and then she crouched down and put both her small hands flat on the leaf litter, the way Dorothy Howell had done in October of 1983, and she held them there. Nora was standing at the upper fence line watching, and she saw it, and she thought about a kitchen porch in the Wenatchee Valley, and a woman named Sigrid Halverson repeating a sentence to a 5-year-old child in a voice that was not prediction, but instruction. In 2010, when young Sigrid was 11 years old, she learned to operate the mobile coop shelter rotation on her own, pulling the hand-built large frame shelters through the northern spy rows on the 4-week cycle her great-great-grandmother had first run in the winter of 1977. Roy Callahan died in the spring of 2003 at the age of 86. He had been coming to Cedar Ridge Road on Saturday afternoons for 19 years. He had learned the rotational protocol well enough to help Nora plan the 1988 expansion cycle, and he had learned the heritage variety economics well enough to begin converting 20 acres of his own 140 to Northern Spy and Cox's Orange Pippin in 1990. The first of what became a gradual transition that his son continued after Roy was gone. He and Nora had become friends the way that kind of friendship has to be built. Slowly. Without sentimentality. On a foundation of one party having been seriously wrong about the other, and having taken the long way around to admitting it. The 80 acres on the Halverson east boundary transferred to the Halverson operation in the spring of 2003, per the terms of Roy's revised will. Nora expanded the buff Orpington flock to 640 hens and 44 roosters to work the new ground. She built 3 additional mobile coop shelters, using the same hand-cut large frame design that she and Earl Voss had first built in November of 1977. The construction took 2 weekends. Caleb helped with the framework. Earl Voss, who was 75 years old by then and officially retired, came out for the framing day and worked from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon and went home in the early dark, looking satisfied. The Pike Place Heritage Foods Cooperative is still in business today, operated by Dorothy Howell's daughter, Margaret, who took over the shop in 2004, when Dorothy retired at 73. The supply relationship between the Halverson Orchard and the Pike Place operation, which began with the contract signed at a kitchen table in Grant County on October 22, 1983, has continued without interruption through 3 renewals and 2 generations of both families. The 1872 Norwegian Hardanger Fjord Agricultural Manual, the one Svein Halverson wrote in 1872, and that Sigrid Halverson carried across the Atlantic in a birchwood box in 1908, is now on display at the Washington State Apple Commission Heritage Exhibit in Wenatchee, in a temperature-controlled case with a small type placard that gives the date, the author, and a single sentence of description. The hand-drawn anatomical diagrams of the European apple moth life cycle are mounted beside it. The handwritten appendix in Svein's own grandmother's faded brown ink, documenting 17 years of pest pressure observations at the Loftus family orchard between 1855 and 1872, is open to page 63, where the 84% reduction figure sits at the center of the page in the careful, unhurried hand of a woman who had spent 17 years making certain. Nora Halverson ran the Pike Place supply contract from 1983 through 2004. renewing the original 5-year agreement 3 times. She completed the federal organic certification in 1991. By the end of her career, the Halverson Orchard covered 140 acres of heritage, northern Spy Newtown, Pippin, Roxbury Russet, Esopus Spitzenberg, Cox's Orange Pippin, and Ashmead's Kernel apples, on the integrated poultry rotational protocol, all of it debt-free, all of it farmed in the way a woman in western Norway had written down in 1872, and a woman on Cedar Ridge Road had decided in the winter of 1976 was worth reading carefully. She did not farm it because it was easy. She did not farm it because anyone helped her. She farmed it because she had read a number on page 63 of a 105-year-old manual 4 times, and trusted it more than she trusted anything else available to her. And because she had sat on a kitchen porch at the age of 5 and heard a sentence repeated by a woman who had crossed an ocean to deliver it, and because the ground had done what the number said it would do, year after year with the same patient accuracy as the woman who had first written the number down. $192. 260 birds. A manual written before her great-grandmother was born. The orchard the whole county had already decided was a mistake, which turned out to be the only orchard in Grant County that the worms left alone on the morning the spray program finally ran out of time. If you have ever trusted something old and careful in a world that was certain something new and confident had replaced it, this story was for you. There is one of these stories in every county in America. This one came from Cedar Ridge Road,